My name's Tom Keating. Good morning and welcome to the Press Club here in Brussels, and good morning to those of you who are joining us online. So I'm the director of the Centre for Financial Crime and Security Studies. And for those of you who don't know RUSI, we are a defence and security think tank with offices in London and here at RUSI Europe up on Avenue des Arts. And our Centre for Financial Crime and Security Studies, or CFCS as we call it, which just makes it a bit less of a mouthful. So we look at what we describe as matters at the intersection of finance and security. And what we hope to do, amongst other things, is convene the necessary cross-sector of expertise and responsibility from both the public and private sectors to unpack and address the financial dimensions of key security threats. We started the program in 2014, and we started the program at a time when actually the idea that the public sector and the private sector should work together was, if not alien, then at least not something that was kind of in the DNA of the security, of the financial crime world, and of the private sector. But since then, working together has become, an important part of the way in which we respond to different finance-based threats. And when we started the program in summer 2014. And the very first opportunity I had to represent RUSI on live television was on the BBC to talk about sanctions on Russia. And of course, since then, it appears as though we have learnt nothing. And since then, we find ourselves, unfortunately, back in the same position we were at in 2014. And I say we've learnt nothing, that's a bit unfair, because actually, as I think we'll talk about today, the response from the European Union, from the US and others has been much more forceful this time on sanctions than it was last time. I think we can safely say that the sanctions in 2014 were sanctions perhaps in name only. So convening the public and the private sector together, I would argue, is no more important than when it comes to the question of sanctions. We'll hear from representatives of the private sector today, and let's just say that any policymaker who wants their sanctions regime to work better make sure that the private sector is involved in the process, because ultimately they are the ones that are central to implementation. So from design to designation and implementation, and from enforcement to disrupting circumvention, the public and the private sectors need to work together if we are going to make sanctions work. Just over 12 months ago, political leaders who had threatened massive economic consequences on Russia if its military maneuvers on Ukraine's borders led to invasion, tragically found themselves having to follow through and unleash the packages of restrictive measures we have seen emerge since February 2022. And since that time, with the support of the National Endowment for Democracy, at RUSI, through our SIFMANet project, we have worked with a consortium of research institutes across the EU, many who are represented here today, to understand how this commitment to use every economic tool available to restrict the funding and resourcing of the Russian military has played out in reality. In late 2021 and early 2022, the political rhetoric on sanctions was cacophonous. I was keeping a log of the superlatives, of the threats, of the kind of extreme statements that were being made with regards to sanctions. We had talk of the biggest package ever, unprecedented sanctions, decimating the Russian economy. Pick your superlative of choice. They were all there. The question, of course, that we need to ask as researchers is the reality of what has been issued so far? Where are the gaps? How do we maximize the effectiveness of the packages issued to date, both via ensuring implementation at home in Europe, but also by identifying and addressing the numerous circumvention opportunities that exist and are used by Russia and its suppliers? The way I look at the past 12 months is that policymakers were running as fast as they could to issue packages as quickly as they could that put essentially a net as best they could around the Russian economy. But of course, from day one, the holes in that net were very large. And what we need to do now is to focus on tightening or limiting the size of the holes in that net. It's never going to be perfect, but we need to obviously focus on how we restrict to the greatest extent possible the size of those holes. And I, for one, was very pleased to see the appointment of David O'Sullivan as the sanctions envoy in the European Union, to actually kind of get out there and talk to both member states and third countries about how we can limit the size of the holes in the net. Now, yesterday, we hosted a day-long interrogation of what has happened so far, what member states have experienced in trying to implement the huge burden of restrictive measures, how the private sector, as I say, the front line of sanctions implementation, has coped with the demands it has faced, and what challenges we identify in the year ahead. There is absolutely no doubting how far the EU has come on its sanctions journey since February 2022. The speed of decisions has been high. Unity has, on the whole, been maintained. Steps that the EU would have never imagined taking in the sanctions sphere 12 months ago have become core to the response. And the impact that we would all wish to see on the ability of the Kremlin to fund and resource its illegal war in Ukraine has begun, and I would stress begun, to emerge. But there's clearly a long road ahead. And Russia, the target of these sanctions packages, can adapt its operations to reduce their impact. Sanctions are not a light switch that one flicks and sees instant results. Sanctions are a long-term tool, a tool that has to be constantly refined, something that we failed to understand after 2014 and the issuance of sanctions back then. Now, many say that 2023 is about implementation, about the implementation of sanctions and ensuring that sanctions decisions made over the past 12 months are indeed being applied. And this is, of course, true. And the visits that we've had the opportunity to make to many countries around the European Union indicate that that implementation is progressing at different speeds and with different degrees of success. So yes, implementation is one of the words of 2023. But I would also argue that the other word of 2023 is maintenance. It's about reacting to the evasion and circumvention tactics that the Kremlin and those seeking to bypass sanctions deploy. I'm always struck when we have the opportunity to meet with representatives of US Treasury's OFAC, how there's someone in the room who is targeting and there's someone in the room who is maintaining, who is seeking to maintain the effectiveness of the sanctions. The target, in this case, Russia, shapeshifts. We need to be able to respond dynamically to ensure that as that shapeshifting occurs, we can likewise respond with the necessary restrictive measures. So with this in mind, following yesterday's workshop, we have published our SIFMANet recommendations for effective sanctions against Russia, which you can find on social media and the RUSI Europe website. I will spare you the details. There aren't that many recommendations, but take a look at them, please, over your lunch. But what I will do is just point to the two main areas where we think we'd like to see further action. The first is to enhance the status quo and improve EU member state implementation. Clearly, we can all point to issues that we have in our own countries where implementation is challenging, where we face difficulties. I'm struck when we talk to, for example, countries that actually share a border with Russia, that they seem to be left on their own to police that border by themselves. What should we be doing to help those countries deal with the restrictions that they are required to implement in the context of trade, for example? But secondly, we need to go further and harder with sanctions and address the current and emerging gaps in the EU sanctions regimes. And of course, this in particular refers to the activities of third countries. It's obviously challenging for the European Union to use its economic heft in the context of coercing third countries to come into line with the restrictive measures that have been issued by the EU. The EU has, of course, resisted in the past the whole concept of secondary sanctions, and indeed has a whole statute for dealing with the issue of secondary sanctions. But I think what we're starting to see is a more nuanced understanding of the issue from the European Union, the ability to sanction entities in third countries that are facilitating EU evasion, EU sanctions regime evasion. And I think we need to think carefully about presenting those countries with choices. I think the oil cap is an interesting example where you can talk about restricting revenue for Russia without even saying the word sanctions, simply offering countries a win-win. Do you want to buy your oil cheaper than you were buying it previously, thereby reducing revenue for Russia? We need to be creative, I think, in the way we engage with these third countries. But we need to remember that we still have considerable leverage over these countries. I was struck on a trip recently to, let's just say, a third country, where I met with one of the largest banks in the country. That bank would like to support sanctions that are being implemented against Russia. That bank has no political cover domestically. That bank has no legislation domestically that allows it to implement the sanctions. What that bank would like is for its correspondent bank that provides it with its connection to the international community to put pressure on it. So I think there are creative ways in which we can help these third countries, shall we say euphemistically, help them come to the sort of answer we would like them to come to. As I hinted earlier on, sanctions are easier said than done, and everyone involved has learned that lesson in the last 12 months. Europe found itself obviously on the front line, found itself facing the need to take active steps, sometimes to its own economic detriment, to restrict Russian access to finance and resourcing for its military. But this is a long road. We must realize it's a long road. The political rhetoric 12 months ago, I think, was in some ways foolish to suggest that sanctions were an instant tool. It is a long road, and it's a long road that needs to be constantly reassessed to ensure that our restrictions remain effective and that we are doing everything we can to support the citizens of Ukraine. So to turn to today's proceedings, thank you again for joining us. We'll host two discussions. Firstly, assessing the status quo. That'll be hosted by our CFCS program manager here in Brussels, Kinga Redlowska. And we'll then turn to a discussion on how we indeed maximize the impact of these sanctions, looking ahead to 2023, and get the views from governments, from the research side, and from the private sector on what we can do to be more effective.